Okay, you can change with this. And by the way, have a fortune cookie.
Thank you.
You can open it right now.
I'll save it for later. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll put it right here. Hopefully, no one's trousers have been too dirty. All right. So, hello everyone. My name is Eero Vassinen. I come from Helsinki, Finland, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the future of news media, subscription models, more particularly. If I can get this to work. Okay. Yeah. So, a little bit about my background. So my name is Eero Vassinen. I started in the media business in 2006. Started writing TV columns for Helsingin Sanomat, which is the largest Nordic daily newspaper. Then, moving along, I've worked for Reuters, Yle, the Finnish national broadcaster, and Bloomberg News, and then more recently joined Sanoma Media Finland on the business side. And now this year started at CIVITTA as a management consultant. So here is the sort of reason of the day. We're seeing more and more of these headlines of legacy news medias posting profit growth out of digital subscriptions. And New York Times, obviously, is one of the more well-known examples of a news media turning their business around digital subscriptions. But today, we're not going to be talking about the New York Times, but we are going to be talking about Nordic examples, because the Nordics are far superior in digital media and subscription models than the East Coast North American legacy newspapers. And there are several reasons for this claim, or to back this claim. Sorry, there's a small latency in the... All right. Here we go. So, thanks. I'll try to be more and more clear. So, why the Nordics are so far ahead? There are several reasons. One of the reasons or outcomes is listed in the Reuters digital news report, which came out earlier this year. The Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and Denmark, all rank in the top 10 in people paying and willing to pay for online news in the world. And there are several attributes to this. Of course, I mean, Nordic countries are digitally very, very mature. Smartphone penetration is almost 100% in the market. Internet 100%. Online news portals have been around for 20 years. Also, traditionally, reading and subscribing to newspapers has been very, very popular. So it's quite natural, actually, that the Nordic news media market is leading the maturity in the world in also the new subscription-based models that news medias are coming up with. Next, yeah, this isn't really doing anything, right? So, so here we have the big picture, and this is from Finland, because I'm from Finland and I get data easier from Finland. But you can easily extrapolate this into the whole Nordics, and the whole Nordics is about where probably the rest of Europe will be in 5 to 10 years, and maybe the rest of the world a bit later. So this is what when news people talk about media disruption, this is what they mean. Basically, what's happened in Finland since 2006/7, when I joined the business, revenues in newspapers have gone down 22%. In print, in magazines, in the magazines business, minus 36%. And online news has grown 117%. Now, there's two major sort of disruptive outcomes or outcomes out of this disruption. Revenues have plummeted, but profitability has plummeted even more. So these businesses have lost over half of their profits. Now, mind you, I joined the business in 2016 when I was 17, which is quite a good example on how good the business was in 2006. You could hire 17-year-olds to write TV columns just for fun. That's not the situation anymore. So they were, to begin with, they were quite profitable, but I mean, this is a huge hit into any business in the world. Minus 50% out of your EBITDA in 10 years. It's quite harsh. Another big element on the how the business model has transformed is that in the early 2000s, over 60% of the revenue was from advertising, and under 40% was from consumers. Now it's switched the other way around, and actually the consumer revenue is growing, hence the digital subscription models. So that's had a tremendous impact on the dynamic of the firms, on the business models, on the strategies, on the way the companies are run day to day. Next, please. So where that revenue drop comes from is the drop in print circulation. So not a lot of print magazines or print newspapers are being bought and distributed and subscribed and read. At least not so much as 10 years ago. Dailies in Finland have gone down 6%, magazines 7%, local papers 4%. And the question is, when will this end? When will print end altogether? Now, there's no clear answer to that. What can be said is that the decline now in the media transformation or media disruption, whatever you want to call it, for the past 10 years has been sort of like glacial melting. It's been slow and quite linear, but we're coming in at least the Nordic market, the maturity pretty soon is at the point where we're going to start losing large dailies because these businesses scale down very, very badly. And they're going to reach a point where their circulation is so small and their fixed costs are so large that they just have to stop with the daily and maybe switch from 7 days a week first to a weekend edition and then cut the print altogether. And my prediction is that in the Nordics we will see very large, very known daily brands going through this last sort of maturity phase, canceling the print altogether in the next 5 years. Next, please. So, on the other side, advertising revenues, which traditionally, a couple of slides ago, the split in the revenues was about 60-40 10 years ago, and now it's about 40-60 B2C and B2B revenue. So the ad market, the development in the ad market has been quite interesting. As you can see, newspaper advertising, magazine advertising has plummeted, quite on the same lines as the circulation has gone down, which is quite natural. But the problem is that these newspapers and magazines haven't successfully gained online advertising revenue because all of that has gone to Facebook and Google. And this is not the complaint, this is just stating a fact. It's gone to Facebook and Google. And actually, Facebook and Google are the only players in the media market who are growing their revenues. And they're growing quite fast. In Finland, Facebook is growing almost 50% year on year. Google is growing about 20-25%. And inside of Google, their YouTube video products, video advertising products are growing almost 100% year on year. So next, please. So taking a closer look at the online ad market, we can see how the online market in itself has developed, and search, display, and social media are the biggest players here. And of course, inside of those, as I just stated, social media search are the dominant ones in that. And an interesting fact is that when legacy medias have now begun to turn their business models into more of subscription ones, is the implications in that is that actually when you change your logic on how you publish online news, and if that logic is based on a subscription model, the KPIs changed so that in a ad-funded model, if you have like a tabloid and then you see ads and then you read the news in between the ads, that actually is not the same logic you want to build your site if you're basing it on a subscription model. So this leads to display inventory lowering. Now this is maybe too abstract to understand, but it means that the dynamic in the online advertising market does not play in the favor of the traditional media companies. So that was the grim sort of big picture we have: tumbling revenues and tumbling profitability, and clear need to change business models and change thought patterns on how these businesses are run. And that has quite successfully in some cases, and this is again the Finnish example, on how in the last couple of years the media companies have started to successfully fight back. So they have in fact now in Finland stabilized their overall readership or reach or circulation if you combine digital and print. And digital subscriptions have risen 30% year on year in the Finnish case. And where and how this was possible is that these newspapers who traditionally, for almost the past like 8 to 7 years from 2007, were focusing on managing the decline in the print circulation, realized that, okay, they finally realized that actually this is not going to work out well for us. We're going to have to shut down entirely in maybe 10 to 15 years, but now we actually just have to build a new strategy based on digital subscriptions. And that's what happened, and the results you're starting to see here. In 2015, so only 3 years ago, 9 of the 28 Finnish daily newspapers had a paywall. This year, the number is 17 out of 28. And I bet next year it will be close to 28 out of 28. We'll have paywalls, and paywall here equals a digital subscription strategy. So, moving on to 3 examples on how these legacy newspapers have been able to successfully turn their business around and fight the declining print and fight the declining and increasingly competitive digital online advertising market. Here's Helsingin Sanomat. Helsingin Sanomat is, by total reach, the largest daily newspaper in the Nordic region, in the Nordics. So Helsingin Sanomat was one of the first players in the world having. They were really early on in the paywall game, so they're not new to this. But because they were early on in the game, their paywall actually, a couple of years ago, it didn't work anymore. The model didn't work. It was old. It was not giving them the results they needed in order to sustain or grow their readership numbers. So what they did was a total overhaul of their strategy, focusing almost solely around digital subscriptions, on securing digital subscriptions. I'm not saying they gave up print or they gave up advertising as revenue streams, but pretty much that's what they did. And the success here is that they now have around 235,000 subscribers in total, out of which 70,000 are digital only. And if you compare this or take into consideration that there are only 5.5 million people in Finland, so 325,000 subscribers is a huge, huge number. It's one of, I think, it's probably the largest subscription-based newspaper per capita in the world. So next, please. So another success case from Norway, Aftenposten. Aftenposten had a pretty thriving, pretty big reach digital business already. They're more of a tabloid type of paper. But they also had the same problem as Helsingin Sanomat has, that their old paywall was becoming redundant. It was old-fashioned. It didn't work. It didn't succeed in getting especially younger readers to subscribe and pay subscriptions for them. They also revamped their strategy, based it totally around securing digital subscriptions and increasing digital subscriptions. Went through all of their content, looked at what's interesting to people, what people would be willing to pay for, and the results are that before they also had the 60%, 40% advertising subscription revenue split. Now over 65% of their revenue comes from subscribers and 35% comes from advertising. So the last success case example we have is Aftonbladet from Sweden. Aftonbladet was quite in a similar situation as the two other examples, was struggling with their kind of old-fashioned subscription system and still had a huge print product and steadily growing digital audiences. And this has kind of been maybe even one of the first papers in the world to achieve these kind of numbers. I mean, I think, you know, 250,000 digital subscribers since they launched in 2003 already their subscription model online is also a huge success story, and number-wise is in the same ballpark as the New York Times, although there are only 10 million people in the world who can read Swedish language news. So, the question is, why has this been possible? So we started off with a situation where we had quite the profitable business, a profitable business model, which was coming down 20 to 30% a year in terms of revenue, and profitability was halved in 10 years. And something needed to be done, and the solution was to secure digital subscribers. Now, in the meantime, 10 years ago, approximately, Spotify was the sort of first major global product to launch a monthly digital subscription model in their music business, in their music distribution. And slowly but certainly, other people came along and kind of on their own and kind of copying from each other came down to this media subscription model where you pay, sometimes you pay $4.99, sometimes you pay $7.99, sometimes you pay $15.99 a month, but sort of changed the business model into this data-driven, marketing-optimized, automated model where you're focused on the quality of the product, and you're focused on the quality of your customer acquisition, and then you're focused on the quality of how you maximize the lifetime value of those customers. Now, newspapers had never done this before because they didn't have to. They were about having a monopoly on distribution, having a monopoly in terms of scale and advantages in terms of scale, they had no need to actually focus on what, when, how the customers and the readers would actually want to consume and how much they would actually want to pay for that. And a couple of years ago, the newspapers realized that actually this is what they have to do, and they don't actually have to invent the business model anymore or reinvent the business model. They just have to take the best practices from the digital, like native digital media companies that were already doing this. So if there's something to be learned from this, is that you can actually transform an analog legacy media business into a fairly modern digital-only subscription model and be independent. And I think independency in terms, especially if we're talking about news media, is more important than other medias, because then you can actually focus on the thing you should be doing is reporting and supporting an open democratic society. Thank you very much.
Okay, and maybe anybody has some questions for Eero?
Sure, yes, please.
Yeah, my name is Juris Kasha. I'm a freelance journalist. And one of the things in the business model that I wonder about is obviously one of the big costs for a print newspaper is the printing plant, the distribution, the retailers that sell the newspapers, the trucks or whatever that distribute the newspapers around the country, and even these days collecting all the paper later on, you know, that doesn't end up in somebody's kitty litter box. How has the increase in digital, has that reduced the costs of distribution? There's less to do now. How does that work out? Because digital distribution is almost free. I mean, you just have to have the high capacity internet connection.
Yeah, thanks. That's an excellent question. And yeah, it's distribution, distribution of digital news is free. I mean, the margin cost is zero. So scalability-wise, it's much easier to do. There's an interesting example of this in Finland, which is a very, very long country with huge distances. There was a daily newspaper in Finland who calculated that it would be cheaper to give some of their subscribers iPads if they were willing to cancel their print subscription. So it would be cheaper to buy them iPads so they could read the digital subscription on the iPad than to distribute the paper to the end user. So that gives you an idea on the cost structure of media. And in the physical distribution system, the last sort of like 1,000 meters or 500 meters is always the most expensive, the final step, and that it raises sort of exponentially, and especially in Finland, if the newspaper route is something like you have 1,000 people in an area of 100 square kilometers, so it's quite a task and quite expensive. So I mean, to answer your question, that's also visible in some of the revenue drop is also based on the digitalization. I mean, it looks drastic, but it's actually natural for legacy media companies to lose a lot of revenue while they're digitalizing their business. Of course, they can lose revenue without digitalizing business. They most obviously will lose revenue if they don't digitalize business, but the digitalization, it drops the revenue because the costs in printing and distribution are super high. Any other good questions?
This is what we get paid for, or, you know, journalists. I don't know if there are any other journalists here. I don't recognize anybody. Anyway, the other thing is when you get the print newspaper, it's printed, that's it. That's what you will get, and that's what you will read, and we remember the famous example of a newspaper that was printed in 1948 saying Dewey beats Truman in the presidential election. The other thing that, of course, could increase costs of the digital platform is that you have to have almost 24/7 manning, so that if you are always updating the digital edition, then you have to have people doing that, and you have to have people able to be there all the time. Whereas the old days, you would close the paper, you'd hear the presses roaring in the basement, and you'd go home.
Yeah, that's another good question, and I think it somewhat it will increase costs, but then again you can time publication of articles, so you don't have to physically have people there, even if you put out content during the evening hours or early morning hours, you don't physically have to have people in the office doing that. You can schedule the day pretty much along the lines as newspaper work has always been done. Newspaper work has always been done also at nights, not even in the digital era. If there's breaking news, it doesn't wait. You have to finish the article. But what digitalization has actually, there's an example. This is also from Finland. The Finnish national news agency. News agencies have typically always had this sort of 24/7, very expensive system, which they've also been very popular, very profitable because they syndicate the content. But the Finnish national news agency actually recruited reporters into Australia. So they have a team of reporters in Australia doing reporting Finnish people living in Australia reporting on Finland because they work the night shift from Australia, which is the day shift in Australia, and living costs are somewhat less also in Australia. So they pay the cost of having a team, 5-person team or whatever they have in Australia is the same as having them in Finland, but they work when it's nighttime in Finland. So I think that's also something that's possible with digitalization, when sort of press releases and everything have been digitalized, so you can have this sort of remote working as well, where you can save some costs.
Okay, then there's Philip.
Yeah, hi, Philips from Delfi. You described the situation in Nordic, and we saw that it's rising there, the paywall situation and the subscriptions. We also know that in Central and Eastern Europe, in many states, this idea of business thinking is rising up, but still we are silent in Baltic states. Do you see any specific reason why it is so?
So any specific reason why it's slower, why the development is slower here than in the Nordics or anywhere? Well, I guess I don't have any sort of. This is just an educated guess. Is that I think the maturity in the Nordic markets has to do with there are sort of very very positive attributes to the market. So a lot of internet connections. Almost 100% of the people have an internet connection. Almost 100% of the market have smartphones. And I mean, I don't mean this year, but Finland, I think, internet connectivity, we had a law 15 years ago. We illegalized not being able to be connected to the internet. I mean, 15 years ago, Finnish state put out the law saying that every Finn has to have the right to access the internet for free. So I think these sort of attributes, and then we have the tradition of, because Norway, Finland, and Sweden all are fairly large countries with very little people living in them, so distances are quite large. So there's a tradition of having your newspaper delivered to your home. So there's a history in newspaper subscriptions, which is over 100 years old. And then also education levels are very, very high. Literacy has historically been very, very high. Interest in news and current events has been very, very high. So you have like all of the positive attributes you could ever imagine supporting the development of digital subscriptions in media in the Nordics. So I think it's a combination of these different attributes or elements that have existed in the market actually for a very long time. And it's just been recently that the companies realize that they have all these positive attributes, that they can actually be making money and securing their future using or like benefiting from them.
Okay.
All right.
Else?
One more?
Just a quick one. I remember I was at a presentation with Aftenposten, that was quite a few years ago, and they said that they engage readers as reporters. There was a case where they were listening to Coast Guard radio, and the Coast Guard radio said that some kind of a ship had overturned in the sea off of northern Norway, and so they looked at Google Maps and they started calling people who they thought could see what was going on and asking them to take pictures. And they took pictures and they had people swimming ashore and all of that reporting was done. They could never have gotten reporters up 400 or 500 kilometers north of the Oslo editorial newsroom. So how much do this kind of reader engagement play in these new models?
Yeah, I think it's easier to do. I mean, technology has made it easier to do, and also sort of encourage proactivity. I think it's fairly standard for all the Nordic medias. The tabloids started it. The tabloids have always had this sort of send in the picture and we'll pay you money if it's newsworthy. But I think also the legacy news medias have now sort of gone into that domain of engaging readers and sort of supporting this sort of like reader engagement. Helsingin Sanomat actually just a couple of weeks ago launched, or they had on their online site you have to register to comment on articles, and they noticed some time ago, that actually if you write an article on something very, very specific, like a deep vertical on whatever, machine learning, they started to get like experts giving commentary on the articles with their own real names, sort of correcting mistakes or explaining it from a different angle. And now Helsingin Sanomat has actually started publishing the best comments in their print magazine, in the opinions section of their print magazine. So they're actually taking reader-created content from online and putting it into the print edition. So I think that's also an interesting sort of development in that same sector. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Applause. And don't forget the cookie. Yes.